Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Spain's decision to pardon 9 pro-independence Catalan leaders may be a sign that Madrid wants to take the heat out of talk of separatism for that area of the country's northeast. But it's been described as showboating that fools no one by the man who's leading the push for independence from exile. And with protests on Spanish streets against the pardons, is the move likely to increase tensions rather than the opposite? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. A recent poll suggested that more than half of Spanish people objected to the idea of clemency. The Supreme Court also made its displeasure known. So is there any common ground to be found, or are the sides as entrenched as ever? With its own language and a population nearly as big as Switzerland's, Catalonia is one of Spain's wealthiest regions. It accounts for almost 19% of national GDP. The dispute with Spain erupted in October of 2017 when a banned independence referendum was met with a heavy police crackdown. In 2019, 9 Catalan separatists were convicted over the failed independence bid. Last week, the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, announced that the leaders would be granted pardons. But that idea has been controversial. Tens of thousands protested against it earlier this month. The Prime Minister expressed hope that the gesture might dissolve divisions. So will the two sides be reconciled? And what happens now to Catalonia's push for independence? We welcome Andrew Dowling, reader in Hispanic Studies at Cardiff University, then to Barcelona, where we see Mar Aguilera, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Barcelona, and then to Brussels, Pieter Cleppe, an EU Policy Analyst. This is something for you all to consider, but since you happen to be in Catalonia, Mar, I'll come to you first of all. Both in terms of the immediate effect and the long term, what do these pardons mean, do you think?
These pardons are giving a solution, a quick solution to a problem that we have here in Catalonia, which is that many political leaders have been prosecuted and have been taken into court, and the 9 independentist leaders have been in jail for more than 3 years. So right now, we are looking for a solution from both sides, and this pardon has this effect that right now, at least something is moving. So in the short term, it's a good solution because this is a decision from the government. It's a decision that is decided alone by the government. But these political leaders, what they are saying is that according to Òmnium Cultural, which is an association, a Catalan association, cultural association, there are still more than 3,000 persons that are still prosecuted in court. So they say this is a big step, but it's not enough.
Long-term solution or just short-termism, Andrew? What was the government's reasoning behind taking this action?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, but it's also a recognition that what Spain has confronted really over the past 3.5 years has been its greatest political problem since a military coup attempt in February 1981. So the Catalan question really exploded on our screens. People became aware of it in the autumn of 2017. And it's an attempt on the part of the Spanish government to reduce tensions. I think we shouldn't over-exaggerate the implications of freeing the prisoners. The freeing of the prisoners was a necessary step to move towards dialogue, because it was a collective wound in Catalan society, whether people were in favour of independence or opposed to independence. All polling over the past 3 years has shown broadly about 80% support in Catalonia for those political leaders to be freed and not to be held in prison. So it provides an opportunity to move towards dialogue. Personally, I'm a little bit pessimistic in the sense that the issues are rather unresolvable, that the perspectives of Madrid and the perspectives of Barcelona are quite far apart. But I do think that this measure has been a very important one in reducing political tension.
So we have these 9 who've been released. We'll hear from one of those in just a moment. But Peter, let me come to you because you happen to be in Brussels. Carles Puigdemont, the leader who went into exile after the referendum, before he could be put on trial in Spain, and remains there. What is his position where you are?
Well, his immunity was lifted by the European Parliament, but this was followed by a ruling by the European Court of Justice that ordered this report on which the lifting of the immunity was based. It basically declared that this was not valid, at least at the first stage. So Spain is having great trouble not only getting Puigdemont extradited, but also other Catalan figures, often because the crimes or the acts that Spain considers to be a crime are not a crime in Belgium.
But is there a suggestion that Puigdemont will be pardoned if he goes back, or is he still very much in danger of facing full proceedings of the law? He
very much still is, as far as I understand, because we are not talking about an amnesty, we are talking about a mere pardon. And as one of the previous speakers has explained, on top of that, you still have sometimes public officials that are being prosecuted for simply doing their job as public officials and signing off on the decisions of elected politicians in Catalonia. So that said, it's a welcome first step, and indeed the dialogue has now been triggered. But I think ultimately both sides will have to compromise. Otherwise, this will not be at least resolved for another 10, 15 years.
Okay, I will come to you a little bit later on, if I may, Peter, and ask you about other European states and the EU's view on what the decision of the Spanish authorities might or might not mean. But before I talk to you again, Mar, I want to hear from Raul Romeva, former Minister of Catalonia, one of those who was let out of jail.
We go out to work for the Republic. Let no one be mistaken. If they think that locking us up in prisons will stop our wish, it is because they have mistaken us as people, and they have mistaken the history. It is necessary to remind everyone.
So there we have it from Raul Romeva. We are not stopping our fight for independence. Was there any thought in Madrid that this might actually calm things down to the extent where they'd forget about it and just talk about it quietly? Because he seems to be very, very much in favour of pushing the argument even more strongly.
In Madrid, it's clear, it has been clear, because all these leaders have been saying this during all the time, even in front of the Supreme Court. They have said that this is what they defend politically. It has always been a peaceful movement. And as the previous speaker has said, there was never violence, and we have a pardon, but the facts, which could be pardoned through an amnesty, are still there with a pardon. So here we have a situation because not only political leaders, but the president of the Catalan parliament is in jail, and also some activists. And this brings up to the question, where will the right to public assembly remain in Spain? And during all the process, even before the pardon and after the pardon, all these Catalan independentist leaders have been saying that they will keep being independentists. So nothing has changed. But most Catalans, there are some that want the independence and some that do not want Catalonia to be independentist at all, but most of the Catalans, they want these pardons, they want a political solution, because it has been for too long in courts, and these decisions from the courts have been...
This is the difficult thing, isn't it? I mean, you have legal judgments which are obviously based upon the rule of law, and that was why these guys were sent to prison. Then you have political decisions and concerns, perhaps, that jailing them has increased the demand for independence in Catalonia. So perhaps it was a political decision on behalf of the authorities in Madrid to say, look, we made a mistake. It's now time to try and rectify that.
Yes, and actually what happened here, it was that the the government that was very tough on the response on this Catalan challenge was another government. It was from the Partido Popular, which is a moderate or a right-wing party. For some, not moderate at all, but it's the right-wing party. Whereas right now, the ones in the government are the Socialist Party with the support of this Catalan independentist party, which is Esquerra Republicana. So for sure, this has changed the approach. And of course, the response is changing because of this, and also because there is the pressure. All these European courts saying that we don't have the same crime here, like in Germany, in Switzerland, in Belgium, and also the European Council. The European Council Public Assembly has asked the Spanish government to release these political leaders. They have said that they are political prisoners, and they have said that the Euro orders should be removed, and that this was an attack to freedom of expression and to the right to public assembly.
We will go into what it is those pushing for independence in Catalonia actually want and how it differs from perhaps the Basque country where they have some of their own powers. But I want to take a look at the atmosphere, whether it is at all febrile, Andrew, in Catalonia, because the king went there this last weekend. He even met with one of the leaders of the Catalonia parliament, and there was a protest. And there we see a poster of the king being burned. We see the king trying to pretend that everything is normal, but clearly it isn't. How much success, Andrew, do you think he and the authorities will have in trying to create an atmosphere for proper civilized negotiation?
There's a number of variables that sort of comment on that. I think one thing that's really important is that most of Catalan society is deeply alienated from the Spanish monarchy. 2 days after the vote for independence on the 1st of October, the Spanish king gave a really hardline speech on television that was really negative, and it gave no kind of moderation or concessions towards Catalan sentiment. It seemed almost to be accusing them of kind of like betrayal by organising this referendum. So most of Catalan society is very anti-monarchical, and that is a different position to much of Spanish society. And I think the other thing we have to consider here is we've got demonstrations in Barcelona, but we've also had demonstrations, a very important demonstration in Madrid. And we should also note that 60% of Spaniards are hostile to the giving of these pardons. There's been a little bit of movement in their figures, but this has been actually quite an unpopular measure. And I mentioned in my first intervention that positions are quite far apart. So you have, in broad terms, in Spanish society, you have a strong commitment to Spanish unity. That's pretty much across the political spectrum. There's no sense at all that the current Spanish government is offering self-determination or potential independence of Catalonia, whereas in Catalonia you have a very different perspective, which is why I also mentioned that I'm quite pessimistic. Once they actually sit down to negotiate, positions are quite far apart, positions are quite polarized, because that commitment to Spanish unity is deeply embedded across Spanish society. So it's kind of, you know, what happened in the UK in terms of a referendum for Scotland, that's almost unimaginable in a Spanish context, that the country would voluntarily permit, if you want, the breakup of the country.
Okay,
that's something that's not on the cards.
There's probably an impasse. You mentioned Scotland, and Peter, this is where I wanted to come to you, being in Brussels. What's the European view on these secessionist movements? Do they take them seriously, or they perhaps regard them as fringe, just sort of aggravations?
Well, of course, all sides always try to drag the European Union level into this debate. So those in favor of keeping Spain united basically then argue that the EU will not accept Catalonia as a member state, and of course then on the other hand the secessionists appeal for more attention to the rule of law situation in Spain, And I mean, to a degree, both sides have a point. Of course, behind the European institutions, you have the other member states. And several of them, I'm thinking primarily of France, are, let's say, very hostile to any secessionist movement. And all of them really are quite conservative and very wary of intervening into what is seen as a domestic Spanish debate. Perhaps in Belgium, my own country, politicians are most vocal because there's a lot of sympathy for independence movements, given the fact that in the north of the country, where the majority of the Belgians live, almost a majority of the Flemish are actually voting for parties sympathetic to independence. Whether you would, if you would put it to a referendum, you may get to a different result.
Yeah, and you've got this idea that perhaps if the independence leaders in Catalonia want to pursue their claim, they want to secede, they should actually look perhaps at a slightly watered-down version of complete independence, maybe rather like Switzerland. And Mar, I'll come to you in just a second. I see you nodding at this because I want to talk to you about the different areas of Spain. But what about the Swiss model, Peter?
Personally, I indeed think the Swiss model is something that at least should be explored. At the time of the great tensions of the referendum, the Swiss government has even offered to mediate in the dispute. Now, I think basically the independentists have to accept that a large part of Catalan society does not want to secede. And I think Madrid and the national Spanish parties have to accept that something has to happen, that they cannot continue on the pure judicial strategy. And then, if you ask me, the obvious compromise, at least a step in the direction of independence, is to grant the taxation powers that the Basque country has also to Catalonia, and for that matter, I would give it to every Spanish region. And particularly the right-wing parties in Spain should look more favorably at that, because it would mean you would have a tax competition. Tax competition is typically something that those on the economic right of the political spectrum support, and it truly would not only satisfy Catalan sovereignists, so to speak, but I think it could also help the more impoverished regions of Spain, like Extremadura, to attract more business.
There was me thinking you were going to concentrate entirely on what was happening in Switzerland with the Italians, the Germans, and the French areas, and there you go off into Basque Country, which was where I was going to lead you, Mar, and you were nodding in agreement to some of what Peter said. So is there any talk about different areas of Spain having more devolved powers rather than independence?
This could be a solution. The thing is that there has not been any proposal from the Spanish government. Right now, even some bankers have talked about seducing the Catalans, proposing something like maybe we can do a kind of confederation like in Switzerland. Maybe we could give more power to the Catalan autonomy. Maybe we could reform our statute. The thing is that everything started because in 2006, we passed a new Catalan statute that was overruled by many articles by the Spanish Constitutional Court. So now the Catalans are saying, if we pass a new statute, maybe the same will happen, that it will be approved by the Catalan parliament, by the Spanish parliament, and then by a referendum. But finally, in this case, in 2010, the Spanish Constitutional Court overruled many articles of such new statute that gave Catalonia more...
The fear is that they might go back on their word again. Let me just ask you this before I move on to you, Andrew. How much devolved powers are there in Catalonia, Mar? Do they have very limited powers, or are they to some extent self-governing?
Autonomous communities, they have a lot of powers. But as Peter was talking about, here in Catalonia, what some want is this tax power, as the Basque country has, and also more influence on education and language. Catalan language is also a big emotional thing, like talking Catalan and all this.
And are there those, if I may say so, who say that with the Basque area having its own taxation powers, a campaign that involved violence is probably more successful than one that we've already heard was not at all intimidatory in Catalonia. Yes,
and also I think this would be difficult to accept by the Spanish government, because Basque Country is a very small autonomous community with lower influence on all the violence in Spain, whereas Catalonia, at least up to now, it has much more population, has much more business, and maybe the rest of Spain cannot afford to have in Catalonia the same system.
Okay, I'm going to go to you, Andrew, and before we chat, I'm going to bring in something that Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, had to say.
The future should matter much more than the past. That is why, even if we understand the reasons for the rejection, the Spanish government has opted for reconciliation and reunion. And we believe that this measure of grace will pave the way for this path and give us all the possibility to start afresh and to do things better.
Is that a realistic possibility, Andrew?
No, not really. I mean, at best, the release of these prisoners is a necessary measure that reduces political tension, but the release of those prisoners cannot solve what is a very intense political problem. And you have a very intense division of perspectives in Madrid and in Barcelona of what is the nature of this political problem. I think one of the things that's really important, in my view, about these types of issues, whether it's in Spain or other European countries, we often find that it's something to do with a feeling of lack of recognition and a feeling that, if we contrast, for example, the Scottish referendum and how people in England responded at the time, including leading public figures, where we spoke about the idea of love bombing the Scottish, where, saying, Scotland, don't go, we love you, we don't want you to leave our country, etc. That type of thing, there's a long way to go in that, particularly amongst conservative sectors of Spanish society, to try to value Catalan culture and identity and Basque culture and identity as seeing these are essentially Spanish. We're a multicultural, multilingual society, and that is our richness. There's a historical issue there that seems to be unresolvable, where so many Spaniards aren't able to see those differences as something positive.
Okay, just a quick one, Mar, as we come towards the end. We started with you because you happen to be in Catalonia. I'm going to come back to you because of that. Is there a sense in some parts of Spain that the Catalans do not deserve to have independence because they are snobs, they think too highly of themselves, they are too rich, and they think they're better than anybody else?
Exactly. Exactly. This is a little bit the attitude. Like they see Catalans as selfish, that we don't want to collaborate with the rest of Spain and with the development and all this. And it also, like, they talk about unity, about something like if it would be something positive, whereas there should be a strong campaign on this, like to be different, to have such a diverse country is, for me, it's something really positive. And this has been seen as a problem. Like if a judge comes to Catalonia, he needs to understand, not to speak, but he needs to understand Catalan, because if you are taken in front of a court in Catalonia, for instance, in Barcelona, you, as a due process of law, you have to have the right to defend yourself in Catalan. But this, for judges from outside Spain, not all of them, but some of them, they think this is annoying. And the same with professors, doctors, and all this. They don't see such diversity as something positive, as something rich, that it brings good things to our country and to our culture.
Okay.
And yes, they see us selfish people that don't want to collaborate with the development of the rest.
Not quite ending in Barcelona, but thank you very much indeed, Peter. Time for one to you. Do you think it's possible there will be independence? Do those in power in the European Union think it's at all likely?
Well, personally, I think it's very unlikely because of the complete unwillingness for Spain to play along, as opposed to, for example, the British situation. And in a way, it's also quite dangerous, really. I mean, thankfully, we haven't seen any real violence.
And the European Union's view is the same as yours, that it would quietly be happy to see it just sort of die quietly and not really pay much attention to it?
I didn't say that. I don't think it's going to happen in a gradual manner. Independence, maybe on the very long term, but not in the medium term. I'm afraid. Whether it's going to just die out, I don't think so. What
I was wondering, and I'm sorry for the way I phrased the question, was whether those in power in the European Union would be very happy to see it just peter out, whether it be for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, or 50 years. Sorry I didn't give you the opportunity to answer that question, but unfortunately we have run out of time. We have covered a great many topics, areas of discussion about Catalonia. Thank you very much indeed from Cardiff, from Barcelona, from Brussels, and from me, David Foster, in the studio. We thank you very much indeed for watching this edition of Roundtable. Would be great to have your company on another occasion. See if you can make an appointment. We'd love it. Until then, goodbye.